I'd like to welcome you to our webinar discussing the Court of Appeals decision on Wynnewood case and the effect on the PSM scope. I am Marla Williamson, and I will be moderating your questions throughout the presentation. Please unmute your microphone at this time. If you have a question, I will unmute you so that you can present your question to the panelist. If you have a question throughout the presentation, feel free to type it in the Q&A box. We will answer live questions at the end of the presentation. I would like to introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Ric Hartung. Ric was the Compliance, Safety, and Health Officer involved at the time the case was initiated by the Department of Labor OSHA, stemming from an incident that resulted in a double fatality. Ric is an engineer as well as a senior consultant and owner of Process Safety Solutions. We also have Robert Ayers. Robert is the partner and co-lead of Holland and Hart's workplace safety and emergency response practice. Robert represents clients in PSM-related compliance issues and enforcement actions. I will now turn the presentation to Ric to get us started with the purpose and intent of PSM leading up to the Wynnewood case. Again, please make sure that your microphone is unmuted at this time. Ric?
Well, thank you, Marla, and I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have some people from all over the U.S., but also internationally joining us today. So I hope that at the end of this webinar, you'll have a better understanding of what we mean by scope and of a PSM program. And I believe that most of the questions that you may have will kind of get answered along the way. So certainly hold those questions to the end, and we'll make sure that we address them if we haven't addressed them along the way. First of all, I want to spend some time going into the purpose and intent of PSM, because I think that that's important that we establish that at the beginning. We can't lose the sight of why the PSM regulation was promulgated to begin with. And we can go over the many incidents that occurred early on before PSM started or was promulgated, but we continue to have those types of incidents since then. So the purpose and intent of PSM is to minimize those. We'll probably never be able to eliminate, but certainly we can do a lot to minimize and reduce the risk of those happening ever again. The tools and principles that help our industry are those PSM regulation elements, and they really are good tools to follow. They don't, and as we know, PSM is not a prescriptive standard, but rather one that allows the facility to define how they achieve those goals within the element itself. Of course, there's members of our industry that prioritize safe place to work and welcome collaboration of industries. And that's kind of what we're doing here, is we're collaborating together to try to help our industries in general to get better at process safety. Most facilities, I would tell you, cannot afford a failure of process safety management. There are many facilities that we know of here just in Houston alone that are no longer in business as a result of a single process safety event that may have resulted in even a single fatality or multiple injuries. They're no longer in business because they can't afford to stay in business when they have those type of incidents. So process safety is really the goal. Following the regulation is not. So if we keep that in mind as we're going through this, that will be important as well. You can achieve both by being good at implementing a robust and continuously improving process safety management program. And that's really what we want to be able to do all the time. Is we should be continuing to get better at process safety each and every day.
And I just wanted to add, Ric, before you go on, certainly agree with Ric that process safety is the goal, but just for context for everybody, my comments will largely be focusing on compliance with the regulation. Just a little bit of a different approach from Ric and I being counsel for these companies. My comments are going to come from that. What do we have to do to comply with the regulation? Thanks, Ric.
Yeah, very good point. Before we continue on, I just want to give you a little bit background of this particular case and making sure we understand the case in as much detail as I can provide. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details, but certainly from an overview or 10,000-foot standpoint. So if you are familiar with a refining process, and I know we have a number of people on here that may not be in refinery industry. You may be in midstream, or you may be in petrochem industry, or you may be in ammonia refrigeration industry. And we're going to hit every one of these industries as we go through this presentation, because all of this applies to every industry, no matter what processes that you operate. But from a Wynnewood standpoint, in this particular case, this involved a refinery, and the typical refinery has many operating units within inside of it. You can have the crude unit, you have the ISOM unit, you may have gas processing, you may have an FCC, a reformer, hydro treaters, but a number of different operations occur within the refinery. Oftentimes, each of these different operating units will have different operating personnel, and at the same time may be covered individually as a PSM facility.
Yeah, just a comment on that also for those of you on the call. Rick mentioned it. I know there's a lot of people that may not necessarily be in the refinery business or be familiar with the inner workings of a refinery. I think one of the takeaways from that slide, and really this one, is that whether you're running a chemical manufacturing process or a gas processing plant, this is similar in that we've got multiple pieces of equipment linked together, connected together through piping. And so those same questions of where does it begin and end really are universal.
Yep. So in this particular case was centered around the fluidized catalytic cracker, or FCC unit. And every typical refinery, as we mentioned earlier, there are several other operating units, and many of them PSM covered. The FCC in general contains threshold quantities of flammables, over 10,000 pounds. And those of us who are aware, when we're dealing with PSM, PSM allows or requires you to aggregate all your flammables. So you could have propane, you could have ethane, you could have other flammables within that process. We have to aggregate all of those, unlike EPA's R&P, where it's based on the listing and whether or not you have to aggregate the listed chemical or listed flammable or not. So one of the flammables in this particular FCC was a byproduct called refiner gas. It is produced in the FCC. Aggregated amount, again, is the maximum intended inventory. It includes refiner gas because it is a flammable. So you can have multiple different types of flammables, refiner gas being one of those, natural gas actually being another one of those, because they're all flammable. So refinery gas is stored and distributed outside the FCC unit, and that's how the Wynnewood refinery was set up. The refinery gas would leave the FCC and be distributed throughout the process through a larger vessel, and we'll get into a few details of that here in just a second. The refinery gas is distributed to other locations within the facility, and it's all used and consumed internally. So it's all consumed and used internally on site. And refinery gas storage and distribution system in this particular case was not considered as PSM covered by the refinery. So the refinery in this case said that the distribution system and the storage of the refiner gas was not a covered process, mainly because they separated it out into a process of its own. And then that process was below the threshold quantity of a separate process. So it was below the 10,000 pounds needed to meet the threshold. Interconnection was not considered. So what was actually taken into account was, as the pipe left the FCC, that was where the hard stop of coverage occurred. It also relied on facility siting study on a separate process and how it affects personnel. So As most of us know, as we do a facility siting study within a facility, we're looking for the effects on personnel. We don't always look at the effects on other equipment and other process within that facility. Not all included in the scope of any other process unit. So in other words, even though it left the FCC and was connected to many other of the processes, it was never considered to be part of any one of those processes. Like Wick said, it was actually considered a process of itself and by itself.
So Rick, at a high level, and I think your next slide's getting into this, just to kind of boil it down, right? No pun intended. Refinery gas is created as a byproduct, gets piped outside, quote unquote, of the FCC unit, stored on site, and then piped back to the unit for consumption somewhere on the facility process or in the facility, correct?
Yeah, either that site or that facility or one of the other facilities or process units within the plant, or it was flared off. At some point in time, it never left the facility. It was either consumed in one of those process heaters, boilers, etc., or it was flared. So this kind of breaks it down a little bit more detail. You have the FCC unit or process unit within the refinery. Again, the refiner gas came out of the FCC, went into a larger vessel, and then from that vessel, it was distributed to various locations, maybe flared, plant process heaters, plant utility boilers. One of those particular items or process pieces of equipment is the Wicks Boiler. And this is where the whole issue centered around in terms of this particular case and this particular incident. The Wicks Boiler essentially received refinery gas. It would burn that refinery gas, produce steam. That steam would be used not only in the FCC, but throughout the other process units as well. The Wicks Boiler itself was within the boundaries, if you will, the physical boundaries of the FCC. May not have been a part of the FCC, but was within the physical boundaries of that process unit itself. Also next to the Wicks Boiler, you'll see I've got a set of lines there above. That was a major pipe rack containing other HHCs and flammable materials that run through them. So what really occurred here is the fact that this boiler and the explosion could have affected those major pipe racks or piping systems that run through the facility. Again, one user of the refinery gas was the Wicks water tube boiler, which was located in the FCC unit boundaries. The Wicks boiler again provided steam to the FCC as well as other process systems and unit. And we know based on the documentation in the hazard analysis that the loss of steam could result in an upset of the FCC itself. And again, loss of steam that was produced by the Wicks boiler. And also the Wicks boiler was located next to and nearly under a major pipe rack containing large amounts of HHC as well. At the time of the incident, the refinery is down for a turnaround. So it had been down for, I believe, a couple of weeks or more already. What was needed, that boiler was needed to be started back up because they needed steam for decontaminating some of the equipment to continue their turnaround. So their plan was to restart the Wicks boiler, to produce some steam to do that using natural gas, not refiner gas in this particular case.
And Rick, on that, does that matter, right? If at the time you're not piping in RFG, instead you're using natural gas, which was not created by the facility, from a PSM scope analysis, is that important, whether at the time you are using it or whether it's just piped, and regardless whether it's coming in or not?
Well, in the grand scheme of things, no, it's not important, because remember I said early on that we aggregate all flammables. So whether it's natural gas or refiner gas, it's still a covered material and would require that to be a covered process piece of equipment in this opinion anyway. Also, what was important here was it was just to make sure we understood that refiner gas in this particular case was not being used, but it was natural gas. Two, the thing I wanted to make sure that we understand as well is that the system was down. So everything was down at this point, and we don't normally, even though I've seen cases of this, we don't go from PSM coverage to not PSM covered just because it's down. If it's PSM covered, it's covered until you've either removed the threshold quantities and made sure that those quantities are no longer intended to be in that facility, or it's shut down altogether. So again, some more background is typically there are no HHCs in the boiler firebox. That's what we want to make sure does not happen. They're totally combusted. So from the point on which the gas comes through the burner tip, that gas should be almost totally consumed at that point in time. So we would not expect any HHCs within the firebox itself. However, and I think this what needs to be emphasized here is there is the potential for HHCs to be present. Rega gaps such as NFPA 85, and most of you, if you're in the industry that uses boilers of any type, you should be familiar with NFPA 85. It's dedicated to address this potential exactly, making sure that we have those systems and controls in place to ensure that the firebox does not contain an explosive environment. This particular case, this boiler did not conform to NFPA 85 requirements. All of the lighting processes and gas control was all manual. So the incident itself was gas or HAC built up in the firebox. It resulted in an explosion on September 28, 2012 that resulted in 2 fatalities. As a note here, I want to say too that there was a previous incident involving the same type of boiler, same Wicks type boiler, same everything in another area plant sometime before that, a year and a half, 2 years prior to that. In that particular case, there were no injuries, but there was damage to the boiler itself.
Rick, as the inspector for OSHA on this matter, how much did that impact, if at all, your analysis on whether this was PSM covered?
Are we talking
by that?
about
I mean, the prior incident.
The prior incident, it really didn't matter to me from that perspective. It did from the standpoint of knowledge. Certainly they had knowledge that these type of incidents have occurred in the past. And that's an important thing to remember, that if we have knowledge of something, we have knowledge of a hazard, we're responsible to address those. That's part of the PSM requirement, is to address hazards and make sure that we have done the risk analysis in our facilities. So in this particular case, OSHA issued 9 PSM citations relating to the Wicks boiler. All were classified as serious, and multiple citations were also classified as repeats. In this particular case, the citations were challenged by the employer, mainly on the grounds that the Wicks boiler is not PSM covered, not part of the process. The boiler does not contain an HAC, and these are the grounds for challenging it. And then the refiner gas distribution system did not contain the threshold quantity of HHCs. Also, the employer challenged the repeat classification based on the new corporate ownership and organization. So in this particular case, the ownership of the facility had changed approximately 2 years prior to this incident.
Rick, can you explain, given your involvement in this case and drafting the citations, the internal process at OSHA for getting these citations, approved and issued? Was there any pushback or hesitation specifically relating to the PSM applying to this boiler?
Well, I think in general, Robert, when CSHO does an inspection, they'll present what they believe to be legitimate citations or areas in which they have concern. So normally that will go through some type of management within OSHA itself, whether it's the regional, whether it's the area office, then the regional office. There's always some type of review that occurs. In this particular case, boilers had never been cited in a PSM case before, mainly because they looked at it from equipment standpoint. Typically, like we said earlier, boilers don't normally have HHCs in them, but they still have that potential. And I think that's what we looked at in this particular case. Yes, there was a little pushback, especially from the standpoint of understanding they were going to be challenged, because in the past, they had not cited, even though they did the inspection of the Wicks Boiler incident that occurred a year and a half or a couple of years prior to that, no PSM citations were issued. So it was sort of like there was a precedence, like we didn't issue them then, why we're going to issue them now.
And so are we going to allow a time at the end of the call for industry to yell at you?
I always give them that opportunity. Yes, yeah. So certainly from a standpoint, and hopefully as we go along, you'll begin to understand why it's important to address this particular item, and hopefully cut down on the yelling part. Okay. So Robert, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick. And let me just say at the beginning, Rick, really appreciate the opportunity and the invite to come and speak with you. I think your insight in general PSM, but specifically on this topic, is going to be really interesting and beneficial for everybody on the call. So greatly appreciate it. So as Rick just talked about in the prior slide, what a lot of this has to do with is that definition of process, right? What is a process? What's included in that process? And so here's the regulation, the definition. And importantly, it's 2 sentences, right? And our first sentence is process is any activity involving an HHC, and including use, storage, etc. So process is any activity, pretty broad definition. The second sentence is specifically important for this case in that this includes any group of vessels which are 1, interconnected, and 2, separate vessels which are located such that a highly hazardous chemical could be involved in a potential release. So as we go through talking about what the Review Commission and what the 10th Circuit decided, keep this in mind, and this, especially this second sentence. What we'll talk about is the interconnectivity provision and the proximity provision. And so these are the 2 we're talking about here: interconnected and separate vessels which are located such that a highly hazardous chemical could be involved in a potential release. That's the location of the proximity element. One thing Wynnewood is going to argue is that this proximity provision applies to that interconnected provision. And so even if you're interconnected, you also have to have a proximity element. And we'll see how the courts respond to that. We can go to the next one.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to point out here too, and especially for those facilities that you may be DOT covered and that you're not sure whether or not you're PSM or PHMSA covered or DOT covered, just remember this on-site movement piece as well. That is a very important piece, and actually specifically laid out in the preamble that talks about this particular item. So we want to make sure we remember that as well.
So as Rick said, it is challenged by the employer. First goes to an administrative law judge or an ALJ. The ALJ finds PSM does apply to the Wicks boiler, finds that boiler is both interconnected and located such that an HHC can be involved in a release. So both here finds both elements are met. It also, and this isn't going to be the focus of this presentation, but just for context, the ALJ also vacated the repeat classification based on, Rick alluded to it earlier, the change in ownership, and looking at the substantial continuity test that found that enough had changed, especially at the EHS level and management level, that these should not be classified as repeat. Again, we're not going to go into that in more detail today. If you have questions on the substantial continuity test or that repeat classification, please feel free to reach out. So from the ALJ goes to the Review Commission. The Review Commission affirms the ALJ's decision, finds that PSM does apply to this Wicks boiler. And they go into a fair amount of detail about interconnected. What does interconnected mean? And it's in my opinion, a pretty broad definition that the Review Commission puts forth, and that they say that if you have an indirect physical link, that is sufficient for PSM coverage. They talk about it does not need to be, they go into the difference between the word connected and interconnected, right? They say here the word is interconnected, and we're going to interpret that to mean it can be any indirect physical link. It does not need to be right next to it. It doesn't need to be, vessel A, pipe, vessel B. Any indirect physical link is sufficient. And again, down here, just using some of their language, it also doesn't need to be involved with the FCC or the ALPA unit or another PSM process. If it's got an indirect physical link to that process, that can meet interconnected. As to the proximity element, they said that boiler is centrally located in the FCC. And even though this incident where the boiler exploded did not cause a catastrophic release at that FCC, it could have. The argument was, well, it needs to be probable. The employer argued it needs to be probable, some realistic probability that a catastrophic event could occur. And the Review Commission said that's not the language. It's could it have caused that HCC? And I think an important thing there that Rick will probably talk about in more detail is that puts more emphasis on the importance of documenting in our PHA what we believe those risks, consequences could be, right? OSHA, and Rick talked about this a little bit, OSHA will give some level of deference to a well thought out and reasoned PHA that can potentially explain, here is why an upset of this piece of equipment would not cause a catastrophic release in HHC. And so Rick, anything you want to add before we go to the 10th Circuit?
No, I think we're good.
So it is then appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And here again affirms the Review Commission. They first address Wynnewood's argument that this vessel didn't contain an HHC and it needed to contain an HHC to be PSM covered. The court rejects that argument, says the plain language of process, remember that's the slide we looked at earlier, does not require an HHC. They go into the text of the language, and if we'll remember, it's any group, the second sentence, any group of vessels which are interconnected and separate vessels which are located such that an HHC could be involved in a potential release. So it does not specifically say must contain an HHC. Court says we're going to look at its plain language. To us, plain language says no HHC required. That's essentially the end of that. We're not going to go and look at extra sources such as the preamble. One thing we'll talk about a little bit in the dissent that Wynnewood argues is, look, when you look at the preamble, you can really see the intent of this was to limit it to vessels containing HHCs. The court says we're not going to look there. It's plain on its face, and that's what we're going to go with. As it relates to interconnectivity, the 10th Circuit again affirmed that that interconnectivity piece is not modified by the proximity piece. In other words, if it's interconnected, it does not need to be located such that an HHC could be involved in a potential release. Now, importantly, as to, well, what did they say about indirect physical link? Is that the scope of interconnected? Okay, it doesn't need to have a proximity element, but is it this really potentially broad definition of anything with an indirect physical link? That they didn't address. That the court found that Wynnewood waived that argument by failing to raise it in their initial appeal brief. And so they didn't specifically address that scope of interconnectivity other than just to say it's not limited by this proximity element. And so the Review Commission's holding on that was upheld. And again, the Review Commission's in my opinion, broad definition on that was upheld. The dissent said that there is a dissent, it's a 2-to-1 decision, and the dissent says PSM does not apply. The dissent goes into some distinction between the first sentence and second sentence. That's arguably a little too textual, but importantly, it says the second sentence, when read alone, is not clear whether an HHC is required to be in a vessel for it to be PSM covered. Therefore, we're going to look to the preamble. And what the preamble says, and an excerpt from it that the dissent used, I think it's important, I want to get Ric's input on, is it says a second sentence has been added. Okay, so if everyone is familiar, preamble gets put out when the regulation is issued, and it kind of explains intent behind the regulation in a lot of situations. And here they say a second sentence was added, and when they're talking about the second sentence, it's the second sentence of that process definition, right? It's the interconnected, and proximity elements. It says this new sentence has been added to clarify the fact that interconnected and nearby vessels containing an HHC would be considered part of a single process. And so looking at that, the dissent somewhat reasonably said, okay, the intent here, in my opinion, was clearly that a vessel needed to contain an HHC. Maybe it wasn't exactly put into the definition of process in the regulation, but that definition is a little ambiguous. So I'm going to look at the preamble, and when I do that, I see, yeah, we need an HHC. And so, Ric, question for you. Why doesn't that? I mean, tell me your problem with that. I think when you read this, and a lot of people read the preamble, they say, yeah, this makes sense. It looks like the intent was to contain an HHC. Why do you think that's not the case?
Well, I think when we look at containing an HHC, yes, we need to have an HHC present in order to aggregate and establish coverage, first of all, right? So if we don't have an HHC in the vessel or piping or whatever the case may be, piece of equipment, then we wouldn't obviously aggregate that to come up with a total. Secondly, yes, we do have instances where a vessel or piece of equipment or process equipment may not have an HHC in it, but it has the potential to. And I think we'll address that here in the next couple of slides, where we're going to talk about and give you some specific examples where that can occur. So through analysis is what we need to use to determine whether or not it should be or should not be included.
Yeah, and to Ric's defense there, if you continue to read the sentence that I just read, from the preamble, it says interconnected nearby vessels containing an HHC would be considered part of a single process, and the quantities of the chemical would be aggregated. So there is a text-based argument that that sentence is specifically referring to how you aggregate chemicals for determination of threshold quantities. One other thing, Ric, I wanted your input on, since we have you and you are specifically cited in the dissent, is the dissent claims that the Secretary's designated representative, Mr. Ric Hartung, acknowledged the agency, acknowledged that HHC was required. And there's an excerpt of your testimony at trial where you are asked, would it need to contain an HHC or flammable? And you said, yes, I believe so, yes. Can you explain that or provide input on what you meant and whether you believe an HHC, or at that time thought an HHC needed to be inside of a piece of equipment to be covered?
Well, first of all, I'd probably been on the stand for about 4 or 5 days, and any question was a tough question then. So anyway, but this particular one, and I remember this, and just keep in mind that we're talking about pages and pages of testimony from a standpoint of this one here particular. I remember that one because yes, it all goes back to the statement I made stated a few minutes ago regarding you must have an HHC present in order to aggregate that amount. So if it's not there, it would not be included. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not included in the process itself. You just would not aggregate what was in that particular vessel. Doesn't take away interconnection or anything like that.
So for the defense counsel on the call, keep the CSHOs on the stand for 4 to 5 days. Beat them up.
And ask the ambiguous questions. That always gets you.
It's always the lawyer's fault. So legal effect from this, right? As I said, this was a 2-to-1 decision. So not unanimous. There was a strongly worded dissent. And the 10th Circuit didn't specifically address that scope of interconnected. As I said earlier, found the employer waived that argument. So there are some legal arguments as to, well, maybe this could be challenged at a future time. Maybe there could be a further challenge about what is that scope of interconnectivity. And all that is fair, but I think importantly, OSHA moving forward, and I think Rick would argue largely was, or at least should have been, enforcing PSM scope in accordance with this decision. OSHA is going to use this as the quote unquote law of the land moving forward. And especially under the new administration, we do not anticipate OSHA to roll back their interpreted scope, especially now that they have a 10th Circuit supporting that scope. And that includes the Review Commission's interpretation of interconnected. Because of that, we are recommending, absent certain circumstances that we can, are happy to talk about it on an individual basis, that employers adopt the definition of process and the scope of process as we see it in the 10th Circuit Review Commission decision in Wynnewood. And so that begs the question, okay, well, we understand what it was in this particular instance. That boiler applied because it was interconnected. Interconnected is not modified, and also it was proximate. But what does that mean for me, right? What is the full scope? And more importantly, or what jumps out to me when I read this is, well, where does interconnectivity end? I think there's a line in the opinion that says there was 4 miles of pipe connecting these, and that's interconnected. So where does that end? And I think with that, I'm going to push it to Rick to answer that question.
Okay. And hopefully I'm going to answer that question in some of these next slides. So.
Whoops, wrong way.
Okay.
Marla, I think we went back one instead of forward one there. There we go.
So I think in this particular case, we're going to try to answer those questions. Where does a process start and end? And where does interconnected end? And maybe who determines where PSM starts and ends? I think those are the questions that should be in everyone's mind when you start looking at your process. If we go back a couple of slides ago, I think Robert was talking about the dissent talked about a boiler is not covered. When we look at that statement in of itself, we're looking at a piece of equipment. And that's not what we should be doing. We're not looking at a piece of equipment. We're looking at our process and where does that process start and end. A lot of times I'll go into facilities, do a compliance audit, or even have done some PHAs where they've determined the scope is from X to Y, and no determination as to why they went from X to Y. And that's important to know. In this particular case, they put a hard stop at the exit from the FCC with really no consideration what occurred downstream in those other vessels. Had they included that in the scope of the FCC or one of the other process units, then they would have been just fine. But because they excluded it for unknown reasons, I'll put it that way, then that's where you entered into a issue now where you have process safety issues and hazards that haven't been addressed. So to sum up the answer to these first 2 questions, or 3, is where does it start and end? Your hazard assessment really needs to determine that. And does equipment need to contain NHAC? Let's go back to that question. No, any activity involving a highly hazardous chemical, including interconnected vessels and separate vessels are located such as, that's the definition of the process. So the equipment does not need to contain an HAC. It needs to contain an HAC, obviously, to aggregate those chemicals, but not in determining coverage. They can be interconnected and separate. Both must be considered in determining extent or scope of the process. That's very important as well. I think for those of you that have been involved in industry, and no matter what industry you've been in, we know that utilities do not normally contain an HHC, and we could all agree with that. That would typically, we do not want our utilities, steam, nitrogen, etc., water, to contain an HHC, but they have. Just down, not too far from here, we had a refinery that had a single fatality due to naphtha in the utility water system. Now, did the PHA address that? No, the PHA did not address the potential for an HHC getting into that system. Had it addressed that, then maybe there would have been some safeguards, et cetera, established, or some other methods determined to address that specific potential hazard. Also, secondary processes may not contain an HHC. A great example of this is an electroprecipitator in an FCC. Typically, these are installed to remove participant or particulate matter as it comes out of the FCC unit itself and the regeneration unit. We would never expect to have and never want to have an HHC in those devices or in that precipitator, because we know that if we got an HHC in the right quantities in that precipitator, that it would result in fire and explosion, and has in a number of cases. So we know that those are two specific incidents where we know that by putting a hard stop or not looking at potential hazards that can occur in that secondary processes or utilities, they can result in catastrophic events or catastrophic incidents.
So Rick, to try to give you a specific example, here we have, and we talked about earlier, the boiler, right, received RFG from the FCC and also sent steam to the FCC. In line with kind of this utility conversation, if that boiler did not receive RFG from the FCC and only acted to send steam to the FCC, right? So only one way, instead of receiving, it's only sending steam. Would that be PSM covered in that situation? And kind of either way, can you explain how, if you were the employer, how would you handle analyzing that?
Well, the answer is yes and no, maybe, okay? And the reason why is, again, looking at the hazard assessment. When we do the hazard assessment, and in this particular case, this rang true, that when they did the hazard assessment, one of the determinations was loss of steam could result in an upset of the FCC. Loss of steam from that particular boiler, or loss of steam in general, would result in an upset. And we know that upsets can lead to catastrophic events, especially depending on how severe it is. And that all has to be determined within the PHA and by the PHA team themselves as to how credible that particular scenario is and what risk mitigation needs to be done. So obviously, if the steam, for example, could result in an upset condition, or a condition which could start or could shut down the unit itself, that may be enough to put it in the PSM program, or need to be managed through your PSM program.
So you're saying, even in light of the current decision, the employer, within the boundaries of what we see and within the boundaries of the definition of process, the employer has a fair amount of, I'll use the word discretion, to appropriately analyze and document their scope of PSM?
Yeah, I think, and that's bore out somewhat in the preamble as well. You know, you talk about the second sentence. If you go down a few sentences after that, it talks about things like a dike. If you have a dike that keeps you from getting into another part of the process, that would be sufficient to break connectivity, if you will. So in this particular case, the analysis is what gets you there. The failure to do the analysis what gets you into these sort of cases.
My last question on that is, so let's say we determine, we take a safeguard for something in our PHA, we determine this utility, you know, the failure of this utility could cause catastrophic release, so we're going to say it's PSM covered. Then what, frankly, right? I mean, surely we don't need to do UT testing on a water pipe. How, if we determine that a utility or something similar is covered, how do we know what we need to do in terms of applying PSM scope and mechanical integrity, et cetera?
Well, I think that's where again, we need to do the analysis. If the analysis is the loss of steam, for example, what risk mitigation factors have we developed to address that specific scenario or concern? So if we're using water, for example, let's say maybe another good example might be fire water. Maybe you've got fire water on one of your vessels, et cetera. And the analysis said that we need that fire water to reduce the potential for a levy of a vessel. Okay, so now we need to make sure we're doing the testing and inspections just like we would through any interlock or anything else that we've developed in our processes to mitigate that risk. So there can be a number of things that you would have to do to mitigate that risk of occurring. That may not be thickness measurements, so that may not be any of that, but you need to do the risk mitigation.
And would you have, I mean, largely, I would assume you can look to RAGA gaps there as available. And then I would guess you still have some availability to really develop your own, right? Assuming it's reasonable and scientific based, your own RAGA gap.
Oh, yes, absolutely. In a lot of cases, some RAGA gaps don't exist for specific utilities. So you can develop your own. You can develop your own anyway. But certainly when they don't exist, you'll have to develop something to address that scenario and again, reduce that risk.
So just from a defense counsel standpoint, again, this just goes to the all important documenting what you're doing, right? I mean, as you've heard Rick say multiple times, what does your PHA say? What is that analysis? Similar to that, even once you've determined, okay, maybe this piece of equipment is going to be covered, making sure you document what RAGA gap, right? What your MI is going to be for that. Maybe you disagree with the RAGA gap out there and agree with another one. It's just really important from a defense standpoint to have that documented and comply with what is written. You've got a much better chance at defending a potential citation if you can show that you analyzed it, and maybe OSHA disagrees with you, but you're in a better situation if you've analyzed it, written it down, and you're following what you wrote down.
So here's a question for you, Robert, and I think this will address some of the questions that I know some in the industry are having, especially. I'm going to get to a few of the others, but this is one question I wanted to ask you. So I have a facility that is an ammonia refrigeration facility. I have two different engine rooms or machine rooms or compressor rooms that contain the majority of the ammonia, anhydrous ammonia being the covered material. One of those engine rooms, machine rooms, contains 8,000 pounds of ammonia below the threshold quantities. At the far end and the opposite end of that facility, have another machine room or engine room contains 8,000 pounds of ammonia, both of them below the threshold. Is that facility PSM covered?
Right, yeah, important question. I mean, I think here we're going to go to the proximity element of our process definition, right? We've got two, both are below 10,000. We're assuming what we're going to talk about, 10,000. We're assuming that's what we're talking about, the 10,000 flammable threshold quantity. And so in this hypothetical, they're not interconnected, correct?
Not interconnected. They're totally
right. So,
separate systems. totally.
Right, and so we look to, can we aggregate them? So now we go to that proximity element. You mentioned on the far ends. I think here, at least in Wynnewood, it was 100 feet from the FCC, although as you mentioned, there were pipes going overhead. Well, I'd say looking at what we have, I think if it's reasonable to say, while we're in that proximity analysis, that, you know, an explosion or upset here is not reasonable to cause an upset or explosion there, I think you have a very strong argument to say, no, you cannot aggregate these. But if they are, maybe if they're 50 feet apart, again, I know I get this question a lot, well, what's the foot number? And it really, again, goes to your analysis. But if they are closer, you know, 50 feet apart, or maybe on the other sides of the same building, I think you're going to have a much harder time, and at least more likely that OSHA is going to say, yeah, those are covered. So it really goes to that proximity analysis. I would think here, far other ends, you know, it sounds like they're more than 100 feet apart. I think you have a really strong argument that no, you should not aggregate those. What do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I in most cases, I would say there would not be covered. And mainly, yes, I do take into account their proximity. But on the other hand, if we go back to the preamble where it talks about the dike, it talks about, even though they can be right next to each other, if you have the risk mitigation factors in place, they're no longer interconnected, they're not tied into one another. You certainly may have built your machine rooms or engine rooms to be explosion proof, or have the proper ventilation, etc. You've put the things in place to make sure that you've mitigated those risks of those things happening. So it also addresses the explosion issue as well. So even though in this particular case they're on opposite ends, I would not consider them as PSM covered. I would consider them separate processes. Because they're separate processes, they don't meet the threshold quantity. So process 1, 8,000 pounds below the 10,000 threshold. Process 2, again, below the threshold quantity, not in a proximity, if you will, that one is going to affect the other in explosion, because I've mitigated some of that risk as well.
Guys, we have a couple of questions coming in. Somebody would like for you to elaborate on could have and versus not possible.
Robert, I'll let you take that one. That sounds like a lawyer question.
Right. Yeah. You know, I think there's arguments in the preamble that there needs to be a probability element, but we saw in this that was rejected, at least from the court, because the plain language it goes on a could have possibility. I think though that it's still, you need to apply a reasonable element. You know, anything within the realm of possibility, I think is too wide. And I think again, it really goes to what your appropriate people performing the PHA decide. I really think you apply a reasonableness to it. Is it reasonably possible that this could cause a catastrophic release, or that this could cause this? And if it's not, I do not think we need to apply everything that possibly ever could happen. Rick, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think reasonableness plays a huge factor. When we fail to address something altogether, that's where we tend to get in trouble, especially when it's a known industry hazard. I think that's the key for me, is looking at industry, understanding that this has happened, make sure we address it in our processes.
Yeah, and again, from a defense standpoint, it just goes back to that importance of documentation, right? As Rick said, not addressing it can be dangerous. If you address it and say, we analyze this, we don't find it to be a reasonable possibility, you're going to have a much stronger defense. And not just defense, a much better likelihood, right, Rick, of avoiding a citation in the first place.
Yes. And this, you know, that's a typical question I get quite often, a little bit off the subject, is just like, you know, I get asked quite often, can you be cited for a bad PHA? No, you can't be cited for a bad PHA. You can be cited for not doing the PHA, but you could be cited for failure to address a hazard. Okay, especially if it's a known industry hazard, you could be cited for that. But I see lots of bad, and probably a lot of people on here probably have seen a lot of bad PHAs. OSHA's can't cite you for a bad PHA.
Okay, our next
OSHA.
question is, what if you buy your steam or other utilities?
Well, as it pertains to whether or not it would be covered or not, it would not matter whether you purchased it or you produced the steam yourself. If you've determined that loss of utility creates a risk for your facility, then you have, and I'm going to use probably a lawyer term here, Robert, you have the fiduciary responsibility to make sure that that steam is always available when you need it, or you've mitigated that risk somehow, or at least addressed it, regardless of who's providing it.
Just real quick, I saw we had an atmospheric storage tank question. No, I don't think so. Sorry, Marla, not to cut you off, but that was just kind of an easy one. I don't expect, Rick, tell me if you disagree, I don't expect OSHA is going to use this opinion to try to say that interconnected atmospheric storage tanks are covered. If it meets that exception of an atmospheric storage tank, I think that's still going to be accepted, exempted from this. Rick, you agree?
Yeah, and I'm going to address that, I think, in the next slide. That slide talks about the Mears decision, which is another decision I think that plays into that specific question regarding atmospheric storage tanks.
Okay, somebody said, I've been out of the oil industry for a while, but while I was in it, we did not consider the tank farm as covered area. Has this changed?
I think that goes into the atmospheric storage tanks question again. And hopefully I'm going to cover that here in just a minute. If I don't, let's come back to that one, Marla, and make sure we address that.
Okay. Do you foresee OSHA using this opinion to argue PSM coverage for atmospheric storage tanks? Is that the same?
Yeah,
Are we on the same
Sorry,
line?
Marla, my fault.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the same question. And
Okay.
hopefully we'll address that here in just a minute, because
Okay.
because that is a very important thing to remember.
There are like 3 of them that are interconnected here.
Okay.
So I think you're going to address them all.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and finish, and hopefully we're going to address that here in just a second.
All right.
So PSM, the extent of coverage, it's not always straightforward, as we're beginning to see. Obviously, there's some things that we have to do within our facility. Not every facility is the same. Doesn't matter whether you're ammonia refrigeration, your refinery, your chemical plant, specialty chemicals, does not matter. It's not always straightforward in a lot of cases. If you have just one process, then it's fairly straightforward. Cover all of that equipment within that process, etc. What if the HAC leaves one process but stays on site? Where does it end? What is the scope? Again, you have to determine that. And if we look back at what we just said in terms of this FCC, they put the hard stop as it left the unit. If it would have been picked up with one of the other processes and addressed the hazards addressed in there, it would have been fine. But because it was kind of left off, no particular reasoning why the hard stop stopped there, even though the HAC was flowing in and across that imaginary line. There was no reasoning for that particular definition. That's why I said earlier about determining what the scope is before you actually had the analysis done. If you have more than one process and HAC does not go to another process, then it must be within the scope of at least one process unit. I always tell people this all the time: let the PHA drive you to the extent of the process. If we do that all the time, then we'll see where all of those potential hazards are. Too many times we set a hard stop and we fail to see the potential hazards. And seeing the potential hazards is what's important. And I think your PHA team is the best one to determine those. Other examples I think that we need to consider here, and this is where we're going to get some discussion here. I know equipment that is owned by others, we've already talked about that. If connected, still part of your covered process. I will tell you that we have several clients that have 5 or 6 different companies operating within the same facility, all owned by somebody else, all being operated by somebody else. It doesn't matter. It's going to be PSM covered. Ownership doesn't play a role per se when it comes to PSM coverage. A lot of times chain of custody meters will say, well, that's a chain of custody meter. It belongs to so-and-so. It's on site, then it's equipment that would be involved in PSM. Pipelines is another one, owned by others, storage, caverns, etc. Those, if they're on site, still PSM covered. We already talked a bit about ammonia refrigeration facilities with multiple machine split systems and making sure we're addressing those. Also, PHMSA, Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration versus PSM. Who has regulatory jurisdiction? Well, right now, I think, Robert, you can chime in here too. This is a pretty gray area in terms of who has jurisdiction. I will tell you, when you look at the preamble, PSM establishes PSM coverage in your facility based on threshold quantities. That if you've got pipelines within the site, those are PSM covered based on the preamble itself. How do you handle inspections and testing? Again, PSM is not a prescriptive standard, so it doesn't tell you how to do inspections and testing. You just need to determine how you're going to do that. I know I have some facilities that they'll actually do the DOT inspections versus API 510, 570 inspections. That might be fine. You determine what your inspection requirements are going to be to mitigate those risks. Again, we need to look beyond the boundary or unit boundary. We need to consider on-site, and I think that's a very important part of when we looked at the definition of process, it pulled on-site, so that's important. One location is the definition of a facility, so we need to go to the definition of facility as well. You can divide the facility, must look at the interconnectivity within the facility. Here, I want to talk briefly about the mirror decision. And this will address some of your atmospheric storage tank issues. The mirror decision really was a decision that was made based on coverage. So we know within the PSM standard or regulation itself, atmospheric storage tanks are exempted, right? So that would mean that I cannot use atmospheric storage tanks to establish PSM coverage. So let's say that I have a process unit that has 10,000 pounds of flammable materials in a process unit. I'm blending materials together. I'm blending materials together and I have 10,000 pounds in that process. Now, because I have established coverage in a process that is not atmospheric storage, then I could actually pull in those atmospheric storage tanks because I've already established coverage. But I can't use the atmospheric storage tanks to establish coverage. So we have to make sure that we understand the mirrors decision just goes to address how I establish coverage. But once you're established, then you can pull in those things to make sure that they're addressing the effects. Remember, those things that occur in that atmospheric storage tank could affect your covered process, right? All process elements must be within the scope of coverage. And what I mean by that is let's not base it based on equipment. Like I said earlier, you could be interconnected to a toilet. I'm not sure why you'd be interconnected to a toilet, but let's say that you are interconnected to that toilet. Just because we called it a toilet doesn't mean that it's no longer PSM covered. If it's connected and I have the potential to have HHC in that toilet, then I definitely need to be addressing that, right? I know that some would argue, and I know there've been a lot of argument that this is not expansion of coverage. I don't believe it's an extension of coverage or an expansion of coverage in of itself. I just think it's doing the thing that PSM was always intended to do, is to address process safety and to the full extent of process safety.
Rick, on that, and I think this may answer one of the outstanding questions. Let's use because I don't believe, and obviously it depends, but I don't believe you think the toilets are PSM covered, even if they're interconnected. So let's say there was an interconnectivity with a toilet. Why do you think, can you explain how that would not be, even if it was quote unquote interconnected, right? Why, what are the situations in which you would think that is not PSM covered?
Well, why I think it's not? Oh, if it's connected, I believe it would be covered.
So if it's interconnected in any way, even if it's to a toilet, and you determine you do not see a reasonable possibility that an HHC is going to get in to that, we'll say, you know, sewer line, you think because it's interconnected regardless, it is PSM covered?
No, just to make sure we understand it. Now, this one comes up quite often. If we're in a PHA and we're releasing an HHC to a sewer, I mean, that's a good example, Robert. If you're releasing certain amounts of HHC into the sewer, then we should be addressing the hazard of flammables in the sewer, right? We should be addressing those things because that is a known industry hazard. That is, there have been a lot of cases where we've had sewer systems, fires and explosion in sewer systems because an HHC got in there. So certainly we should be addressing that as the hazard and documenting that we did. Now, whether or not it's quote PSM covered or not, I don't think that's really the point, and it would really be considered the sewer is PSM covered. Also, you know, we want to just say, you know, you should consider a second or third party review of your PSM scope. And of course, there are some benefits of that. Obviously, conducting underprivileged, you know, Robert can address those sort of things, and we do that quite often. We address some of these under a privilege, and that way you have the opportunity to see where your gaps are in terms of PSM.
Right, yeah, obviously we have audit requirements under the PSM standard, and those cannot be underprivileged, are not underprivileged, but the facility wants to perform a review of, hey, we think we might have gaps, whether it's to our PSM scope or our processes inside, you know, are we doing, we have the right PSI, do we have the right MI in place? You can choose to do that review, retain counsel, and do that review under privilege that allows you to keep the results of that analysis, gap analysis, if you will, prevented from being disclosed to OSHA if it's appropriately conducted under privilege. Again, if you have any questions on that, please let us know, but it's certainly something that we do with Rick quite often. Marla, I wanted to address, I know we're a little over time, this question I see, it looks like we have two outstanding questions. And Rick, you addressed it a little bit, but I think it's a really important question. And that's in the example that I gave earlier about the boiler sending steam, but not receiving RFG. We said an analysis is required to determine whether it's PSM covered. But what if that analysis finds if there's a loss of steam or if anything happens to this boiler, it's not going to create a catastrophic release. It's not going to create a release of an HHC, but it's still quote unquote interconnected because it still has, whether it's a mile or 2 miles of pipe connecting steam. So no potential for a release, but still interconnected with the utility. How do you address that, Rick?
Yeah, again, I think you said doing the analysis is the first important part of that, making sure that there are no circumstances or scenarios, credible scenarios, obviously, that would result in loss of steam, creating a hazard or a potential hazardous event. That's step number one. Step number two is determining whether or not a fire and explosion from that particular boiler within the area in which it's located, if that in of itself could create a release of an HAC, then that would have to be addressed as well. If it does create a release, then obviously you would need to treat it as such and mitigate that risk as well. But just a utility boiler sitting out there just operating using natural gas, it's a process of its own. No, it would not be considered normally covered.
And I think that's a huge, and I'm sorry we had to get to that 10 minutes after. I think that's a big point, and one of the things that I've really enjoyed in working and speaking with Ric, particularly on this case. That's because when I read the review commission, I'm with the person who asked the question. I think that's the concern that jumps out to me. And I think what we're hearing Ric say is, in his opinion, again, review commission, I would argue, and I think the legal argument probably goes to, yes, that's interconnected, but I think the reasonable nature of it and what Ric is saying is there is a limitation to that interconnected. It's not necessarily as plain as you may read the review commission to be, right? Every case is interpreted in light of its own facts. So in a different set of facts, there is, as Ric said, and I would agree, potential that even if something is interconnected, again, this is a gray area, but even if something is interconnected, there is a potential that maybe that is not covered by PSM based on, I won't rehash them, but based on the factors that Ric just laid out.
Right. Yeah, and there's another letter of interpretation that I think was an Axio Nobel case that talks about the fact that you cannot use a control to determine coverage, right? So let's say that I have a control valve or some type of other control mechanism that theoretically stops an HAC from getting from point A to point B. That could not determine coverage, and the reason why is things fail. We do that in PHAs all the time. We address those particular scenarios where that relief or that device actually fails. When it fails, what happens? And usually those failures result in some pretty catastrophic events. And usually those catastrophic events is what normally gets us. So if we in our PHA say that the loss of a primary containment results in a fire and explosion, and we haven't addressed that in any way, then obviously that's an issue, right? So those are the things that we need to make sure we're addressing and documenting in our programs. Do we have any live questions?
So we have a typed in question. Did your answer encompass the other one? Because it was kind of like a two-part question.
Okay,
So,
I see one outstanding question.
Right.
It says, in the case of a boiler, if a site is following boiler code, completed PHA on the boiler, had appropriate safeguards in place, but the site does not classify the boiler as being part of a covered process, are they okay? They are completing the appropriate checks and analyses, but they are not including the boiler within the documented quote unquote process boundaries within their PSM program. I think you are okay, right? What the PSM standard, if you're following all the elements of PSM, but you just don't call that PSM, I think you've got a really good argument. Where's OSHA going to cite you, right? They have to point to a regulation and say, you failed to do this, right? Your PHA was wrong. You weren't doing MI. You didn't have a developed MI procedure, whatever it is. If you're meeting all those, to me, whether you call it within a process boundary or not, is not itself going to rise to a citation. Ric, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're already doing all of those things, they can't cite you even under a general duty clause because you're following the recommended practices. So in that particular case, whether you call it PSM covered or not, you're actually doing above and beyond, going above and beyond from a mechanical integrity and risk standpoint.
I never put it past OSHA what they can cite somebody under the general duty clause for. So, but yeah, I agree. I think in that situation, it's unlikely they would even issue a GDC, although we've seen some crazy ones.
Well, that's true too. I have.
And I think, Rick, you said this to me privately. I know we're past on time. Thanks to everybody for staying on. So I don't want to belabor this point, but it also just, it really depends on, it can really depend on the inspector you get. There are checks, as Rick talked about earlier, you know, at regional level, and sometimes even at national level before citations get issued, especially high profile ones. But, you know, the citations that at least that get issued are really dependent on who comes out to your facility. And in areas, you know, Rick was in Houston, there's some good knowledge in Houston and other parts of the country. There's less PSM expertise and knowledge. And so it really can depend. And then this really goes more to our defense, right? Once a bad citation is issued compared to not having one issued in the first place.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Robert, and I think that's a great point, is even when I was with OSHA, we have to keep in mind that, you know, you have 4 elements that you need to ensure before you can issue the citation. Obviously, those are, you have to have a standard that was violated. You have to have knowledge. You have to have a hazard. So you have to have those elements or prima facie elements in place in order for that citation to be issued. Keep in mind that very few compliance officers want to end up in court. You know, so if we don't have the evidence, you didn't have the knowledge to be able to defend it on a witness stand, you may not issue the citation, or the citation may be issued, and then if it wasn't challenged, fine. If it was challenged, then there's some negotiation going on. So really those things that really get to the heart of and soul, I believe, of PSM and making sure we're applying, those are the things that we talked about today. So do we have any live questions, or is that all the questions for today? I think if you have a live question, all you'd have to do is you'd have to unmute Marla. You would have to unmute.
They raise their hand.
Raise your hand and
then I'll unmute it, or you can type it either way.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any questions.
Great. Well, obviously, if you have questions, please feel free. I think the next, you should be able to, by Googling either of us, get our contact info, but there it is also. If you do have any questions, please don't. I'm sure the same is for Rick. Do not hesitate to reach out. Happy to talk about this. Any questions about doing, you know, analyses to determine whether any of your facilities are meeting this scope, please let us know. Again, I want to reiterate, thank you everybody for participating. I hope you found it as beneficial as I did when I talked to Rick. And again, Rick, thanks so much for doing this, inviting me to do it. I think this was fantastic. Really appreciate your great input.
Well, I appreciate it, and I really appreciate everybody's participation in this. I think, you know, at the end of the day, just like the first slide that I talked about was process safety being the intent and goal. And I think the more we learn, the more we can converse back and forth from a legal standpoint, from an engineering standpoint. I'm just an engineer, you know, so the more we can converse back and forth, we know what the things that we need to do to make our processes better and to eliminate as much risk and as possible. So I appreciate everybody.
So before we sign off, I've had several people pop in on the chat and ask if there will be a copy of the presentation. I will post the video on our website, which is PSSSolutionsLLC.com. So you can just look at us under our webinar page and I'll post it up there.
All right. Well, thank you all, and I appreciate it. And Robert, again, I appreciate you helping me and going through this with me. It's been a joy, and I appreciate everybody's involvement. Thank you, and I hope you have a safe day.
Thanks, everybody.